The air in the Emerald Room was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and the weight of a $50 million deal. Roman Caldwell, the man they call the Concrete King of Seattle, didn't move an inch when the heavy oak doors creaked open. He didn't move when his guards reached for their holsters. He only froze when a small, trembling hand clutched his black silk sleeve. There stood Violet, 7 years old, wearing a yellow dress stained with the grease of the city's underbelly, her long dark hair matted with rain. In a room full of the city's most dangerous men, she was the only one not afraid. She didn't look at the guns. She looked only at Roman with a fierce, determined stare that mirrored a ghost from his own past. You might think Roman would have her tossed out. You might think a mafia boss has no room for a child's whims. But stay until the end of this story, because what Roman did next didn't just break the rules of the underworld, it shattered the high society facade of Seattle forever. With a shaking finger, Violet pointed directly across the table at Julian Vane, the city's most beloved billionaire philanthropist. Her voice was a whisper, but in the sudden silence of the gala, it sounded like a gunshot. That's him. That's the man who took them. Roman Caldwell moved through Seattle not as a man, but as a force of nature. As he stepped out of the Emerald Room, the heavy rain did not seem to drench him so much as it retreated from his path. His black umbrella was held by a man twice the size of a professional linebacker, yet even he kept a respectful, terrified 3-inch distance from Roman's shoulder. To the public, Roman was a titan of logistics and shipping. To the underworld, he was the Iron Kingpin, the man who had turned the chaotic violence of the 90s into a silent, high-margin machine. His daily life was a masterclass in cold calculation. Back at his headquarters, a glass and steel monolith overlooking the gray churn of Elliott Bay, Roman sat behind a desk carved from a single piece of obsidian. There were no phones on his desk, only a single ledger and a fountain pen. He didn't need to shout to exert power. In the hierarchy of the Caldwell Syndicate, a raised eyebrow from Roman meant a lost contract. A narrowed gaze meant a lost life. Earlier that morning, he had sat through a briefing regarding a dockworkers' strike. Most men in his position would have sent enforcers with brass knuckles. Roman simply looked at the spreadsheets, identified the 3 union leaders with the highest gambling debts, and bought their markers. By noon, the strike had vanished. He didn't enjoy the fear he instilled. He simply viewed it as the most efficient lubricant for the wheels of industry. He lived by a singular, frozen mantra: emotion is a variable I cannot afford. His body was a map of this philosophy. Beneath the $5,000 charcoal suit, his skin was etched with ink, traditional Nordic runes and maritime markers that spoke of a harder, bloodier time. The tattoos on his hands were the only things he couldn't hide, permanent reminders of the street brawls he had survived to reach the top. He was a man who had built a fortress around his soul, brick by frozen brick, until he had forgotten what it felt like to be warm. But as he sat in the back of his darkened Maybach, the city lights blurring into streaks of neon blue and gold against the glass, his hand kept drifting to his silk sleeve. He could still feel the phantom pressure of Violet's small, cold fingers. For 20 years, no one had touched him without his permission. No one had dared to look him in the eye without flinching. Yet that little girl in the tattered yellow dress had looked at him as if he weren't a monster, but a last resort. He stared out at the Seattle skyline, his intense dark eyes reflecting the predatory stillness of a shark. He had spent his life ensuring that he owed no one and that no one could get close enough to hurt him. But the Iron Kingpin was starting to realize that the girl hadn't just pointed at a villain, she had pierced the armor he had spent decades forging. The obsidian desk and the cold neon of Seattle faded as Roman leaned his head against the cool leather of the headrest, closing his eyes. Suddenly, he wasn't the Iron Kingpin. He was 12 years old, standing in a cramped, radiator-hissing apartment in the Rainier Valley. The air there didn't smell like expensive cigars, it smelled of cheap laundry detergent and the iron tang of the winter rain leaking through a cracked window pane. In the center of that memory stood Sarah. She was 9, with the same defiant spark in her eyes that Roman had seen in Violet tonight. She had been wearing a hand-me-down coat, clutching a handful of wildflowers she'd picked from the median of a busy street. Roman was her shield, her self-appointed guardian in a neighborhood where the shadows had teeth. He had promised her, with the naive arrogance of a big brother, that nothing would ever touch her. The memory shifted, turning jagged and cold. It was a Tuesday evening, the sky the color of a fresh bruise. Roman had stayed late at a neighborhood gym, lured by the promise of learning how to fight so he could better protect their little corner of the world. When he returned, the apartment door was swinging open, the cheap plywood splintered. The wildflowers were scattered across the linoleum floor, crushed under the weight of heavy boots. Sarah was gone. He had run to the local precinct, his lungs burning, only to be met by a desk sergeant who didn't even look up from his coffee. To the city, they were just 2 more nameless kids lost to the cracks of a broken system. He had spent weeks scouring the docks, screaming her name into the salt spray of the Pacific, but the silence that followed was absolute. That silence had entered his bones, turning his heart into the very iron that now defined his empire. He had realized then that in this world, being good was a death sentence. You had to be the monster the other monsters feared. A sharp jolt as the Maybach hit a pothole snapped Roman back to the present. He opened his eyes, his breath hitching for a fraction of a second before the mask of the kingpin slid back into place. He looked down at his hands, the tattoos covering the scars of 1,000 battles fought to ensure he would never be powerless again. He realized now why his blood had turned to ice when Violet pointed her finger. It wasn't just the boldness of the gesture, it was the fact that she was the same age Sarah had been when the world swallowed her whole. For 30 years, Roman had told himself that Sarah was a casualty of a war he hadn't been ready to fight. But looking at the rain-streaked window, he saw Julian Vane's face in his mind, the billionaire philanthropist, the man Violet had identified as the villain. Roman's jaw tightened. He hadn't been strong enough to save the girl in the hand-me-down coat 30 years ago, but as the car pulled into the underground garage of his fortress, he knew one thing with terrifying certainty. He was strong enough now. Roman did not go to bed. Sleep was for men who didn't have ghosts to avenge. Instead, he retreated to the war room, a subterranean level of his estate, where the air was filtered and the walls were lined with servers humming like a hive of digital wasps. He sat before a wall of monitors, his face bathed in the cold blue glow of data streams. Across from him sat Elias, a man whose fingers moved across a keyboard with the precision of a concert pianist. Elias, Roman said, the name tasting like ash. Show me the man behind the halo. On the screens, the public image of Julian Vane flickered to life. Vane cutting ribbons at children's hospitals. Vane shaking hands with the governor. Vane donating $10 million to urban renewal. He was the golden boy of the Pacific Northwest, a man who seemed to be made of nothing but light. But as Roman watched, he saw the same thing he saw in the eyes of the apex predators he dealt with daily: a void. Elias began to dig. He bypassed the firewalls of Vane's Harmony Foundation and tunneled into the private ledgers. For the first hour, everything looked pristine, but Roman had a nose for rot, and he found it in the logistics. Look at the shipping manifests, Roman commanded, pointing to several shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands. He's moving medical supplies to Eastern Europe, but the weight of the containers doesn't match the cargo. Those crates are too light for heavy machinery, but too heavy for gauze. As Elias cross-referenced the shipping dates with local missing persons reports, the pattern emerged with sickening clarity. Every time a Vane-chartered vessel left the port of Seattle, a cluster of runaway cases disappeared from the police blotter. These were children the system had already forgotten, foster kids, immigrants, the invisible. Vane wasn't just a philanthropist, he was a harvester. He used his charity as a scouting net, identifying the most vulnerable and then using his private fleet to vanish them into a global network of shadows. The final piece of evidence was a grainy, high-angle security still Elias pulled from a deleted folder in Vane's private cloud. It showed a black SUV in a rain-drenched alley 3 nights ago. The door was open, and for a split second the camera caught a flash of yellow, a small girl in a tattered dress being shoved into the back seat. Standing by the door, holding an umbrella with a casual, bored expression, was Julian Vane. The silence in the war room became deafening. Roman leaned back, his leather chair creaking. He had spent his life surrounded by killers, thieves, and liars, but this was a different kind of darkness. This was a man who used the mask of a savior to hunt the helpless. Roman's hand tightened around a glass of neat bourbon until the knuckles turned white, the runes on his skin seeming to pulse in the blue light. The Iron Kingpin had spent 30 years trying to forget Sarah, but in Julian Vane, he had finally found the man who represented every shadow that had ever haunted him. "Elias," Roman whispered, his voice vibrating with a terrifying low-frequency rage. "Prepare the men. We aren't going to war for territory this time. We're going for his throat." The black Maybach glided into the belly of Roman's primary safe house, a fortress hidden behind the facade of an old brick industrial laundry. The air inside smelled of ozone and gun oil, a stark contrast to the rain-scented night. Roman stepped out first, his presence alone causing the dozen men stationed in the garage to snap to attention. These were men forged in the fires of the city's darkest alleys, scars across their brows, tactical gear cinched tight, eyes that had seen too much. Then Roman reached back into the car. He didn't bark an order or offer a stern hand, he simply waited. Violet stepped out, her small yellow dress a startling splash of color against the concrete and steel. She looked up at the towering, armed men with their submachine guns and stone-cold expressions. She didn't flinch, she didn't hide behind Roman's legs. She simply smoothed the wrinkles of her skirt and looked them in the eye, one by one. "This is Violet," Roman said, his voice echoing with a finality that brooked no questions. "From this moment, her breath is more important than yours. If she trips, you catch her. If she's hungry, you feed her. If anyone approaches this gate without my seal, you do not ask for ID. You end them." Marco, a lieutenant who had spent 15 years as Roman's most ruthless enforcer, stepped forward to hand Roman a briefing folder. He looked down at the girl, his hand instinctively resting on the holster at his hip. Violet looked up at him, noticed a loose thread on his tactical vest, and reached out with a small, steady hand to pluck it off. "You have a smudge on your nose," she said quietly, pointing to a bit of grease Marco had picked up while checking the perimeter. The garage went silent. The guards held their breath, expecting a flash of Roman's temper at the girl's boldness. Instead, Marco, a man known for breaking bones without blinking, slowly reached up, wiped his nose with a massive thumb, and looked at the girl with a bewildered, lopsided grin. "Thanks, kid," he grunted. Roman watched this exchange with a predatory stillness. He saw his men, killers all, suddenly adjusting their stances, softening their glares. It wasn't pity, it was a strange, long-forgotten sense of duty. They weren't just protecting a high-value asset anymore. They were protecting the only innocent thing left in their world. He led her to a secure suite on the top floor, filled with plush rugs and mahogany furniture. As she sat on the edge of a massive bed that seemed to swallow her whole, she looked at Roman. "Are you going to hurt the man in the suit?" she asked. Roman knelt down, a gesture that would have shocked the city's underworld to its core. He looked at the girl who'd done what no army could. He looked at the girl who had found the crack in his iron heart. "No, Violet," he whispered, his eyes dark with a promise of absolute ruin. "I'm going to do something much worse than that." The following night, the fog rolled off the Puget Sound like a funeral shroud, masking the movement of blacked-out SUVs weaving through the industrial labyrinth of the docks. Roman Caldwell stood on a rusted catwalk overlooking Pier 42, his coat fluttering in the salt-heavy wind. He didn't carry a weapon. He didn't need to. He was the conductor of a symphony of destruction, and his men were the instruments. The target was Julian Vane's primary export hub, a warehouse that officially processed medical relief packages, but unofficially served as the transit point for Vane's human cargo. At precisely 2 a.m., the silent efficiency of the Iron Kingpin's empire was unleashed. There were no sirens, no shouting. There was only the rhythmic thwip of suppressed rifles taking out the high-tech security cameras and the heavy thud of Vane's private security guards hitting the floor. Roman's men moved with a terrifying synchronized grace. They didn't just raid the facility, they dismantled it. They used thermal lances to slice through the reinforced steel of the secret shipping containers Elias had flagged. When the doors groaned open, they didn't find bandages or medicine. They found cramped, windowless living quarters and stacks of forged passports. The evidence was overwhelming, but Roman didn't call the police. He wasn't interested in a trial, he was interested in a message. "Burn the manifests," Roman commanded into his comlink. "Seize the encrypted drives, and the cargo ship in the harbor, sink it at the berth." By 3 a.m., the sky over the port of Seattle was orange with the glow of controlled, strategic fires. Vane's multi-million-dollar logistics network was being shredded in real time. Roman watched as his men loaded the rescued survivors into a fleet of unmarked ambulances, destined for his private clinics where they would be cared for in total secrecy. As the final container was cleared, Roman took a spray paint can from one of his lieutenants. On the side of Vane's pristine white office trailer, he didn't leave a signature or a threat. He simply painted a single jagged yellow line, the color of a small girl's dress. The message was sent. To the rest of the city, it was a gang war. To Julian Vane, who would wake up to find his offshore accounts frozen and his ships at the bottom of the Sound, it was a declaration of total annihilation. The king wasn't just defending his territory anymore, he was hunting. Roman looked at the rising smoke and felt a cold, sharp satisfaction. For the first time in 30 years, the silence of the docks didn't feel like a haunting. It felt like the calm before a very intentional storm. The rain had turned into a steady, freezing drizzle by the time Chief Miller arrived at the industrial laundry. He didn't come with sirens or a warrant. He came alone, his expensive sedan idling at the gate like a nervous animal. Roman met him in the center of the garage, the overhead lights casting long, distorted shadows across the concrete. Chief was a man who had built his career on the careful calibration of looking the other way, but tonight his face was the color of curdled milk. "You've lost your mind, Roman," Chief started, his voice cracking as he stepped into the Iron Kingpin's orbit. "Pier 42, sinking a freighter? You're making enough noise to wake the dead. You need to walk away from Vane, right now." Roman didn't respond immediately. He took a slow, deliberate puff of a cigarette, the ember glowing like a dying star in the gloom. "I don't recall asking for your advice, Miller. I pay you to manage the traffic, not the destination. This isn't just about a few dock fees anymore," Miller hissed, stepping closer, his eyes darting towards the silent guard standing in the rafters. "You think Julian Vane is just another suit? He's the foundation this city is built on. His reach goes past the governor. It goes all the way to the federal benches.
There are people in D.C. who eat off the silver Vane provides. You touch him, and you're not just starting a street war, you're pulling the thread on a sweater that covers some very powerful shoulders. They will erase you. They'll pave over your empire and act like you never existed. Roman leaned in. The scent of expensive tobacco and cold iron surrounded the chief. Tell me, Miller, when you took Vane's money, did you know what was in the containers? Did you know he was trading in lives, or did you just like the weight of the envelope? Miller flinched, his silence giving more away than a confession ever could. It doesn't matter what I know. What matters is that Vane is untouchable. He has a dead man's switch, evidence on every cop, judge, and politician in the state. You move on him and the whole city burns. Is a little girl in a yellow dress really worth all this? Roman straightened his suit jacket, his eyes turning into shards of black glass. The fear Miller was trying to instill was a currency Roman no longer accepted. You've spent so long protecting the monster that you've forgotten what it's like to fear the predator, Roman whispered. Vane may have the city in his pocket, but he's forgotten who owns the streets. If the city has to burn to smoke him out, then I'll be the one holding the match.
Roman turned his back on the chief, a gesture of ultimate disrespect. As Miller scrambled back to his car, Roman looked up at the mezzanine where Violet stood, watching the exchange with her silent, haunting intensity. The roots of the rot went deep, but Roman had never been afraid to dig. The following Tuesday, Julian Vane hosted his annual Crowning Achievement Gala at his hilltop estate, a glass cathedral of arrogance overlooking the city. Inside, the elite of Seattle sipped vintage champagne, blissfully unaware that the shadows were moving against them. Roman Caldwell stood on a ridge half a mile away, watching the glowing mansion through a pair of thermal binoculars. He wasn't wearing his charcoal suit tonight. He was in matte black tactical gear, the Nordic runes on his hands covered by combat gloves. Chief Miller was right about one thing, Roman said into his headset, his voice a low, rhythmic vibration. Vane thinks he's untouchable. Let's show him he's just reachable. The assault was a masterclass in silent violence. Roman didn't use explosives or sirens. He used the darkness he had mastered over 30 years. His shadow teams moved in 3 prongs. The first team neutralized the perimeter sensors using a high-frequency jammer Elias had tuned specifically for Vane's security grid. The second team, led by Marco, scaled the sheer cliffs behind the estate, taking out the rooftop snipers with synchronized precision. Roman led the third team through the front gates. They didn't break them down. They simply walked through after Elias hacked the electronic locks. As Roman moved through the manicured gardens, he felt a strange, cold clarity. He wasn't just a mafia boss tonight. He was the reckoning that Sarah never got, and the promise he had made to Violet. Inside the ballroom, the music was a soft string quartet. It died a sudden, jarring death as the power flickered once, twice, and then vanished. In the sudden pitch blackness, the only sound was the collective gasp of the city's elite. Then the emergency lights kicked in, not the warm glow of the chandeliers, but the harsh, flickering red of the backup system. The doors to the ballroom didn't burst open. They were opened with terrifying calmness. Roman Caldwell stepped into the room, flanked by 6 men in full tactical gear, their faces hidden by ballistic masks. The guests shrieked and scrambled back, but Roman's eyes were locked on the head table. Julian Vane stood there, his wine glass trembling in his hand, his philanthropist mask finally beginning to crack. He looked around for his private security, but all he saw were Roman's men standing where his guards should have been. "Roman, you're making a mistake," Vane stammered, his voice echoing in the hollow silence of the room. "The people in this room, the connections I have, you'll be dead before the sun rises." Roman walked toward him, the heavy thud of his boots the only sound in the hall. He didn't pull a gun. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, tattered yellow ribbon he had taken from Violet's dress. He laid it on the white linen tablecloth in front of Vane. "The sun isn't coming up for you, Julian," Roman whispered. "The shadows are done hiding." Julian Vane looked down at the yellow ribbon, his face draining of its last vestiges of color. "You think a piece of fabric is going to hold up in court?" he sneered, though his voice lacked its usual bite. "I own the judges, Roman. I own the archives. Anything you think you found, I've already erased." Roman didn't flinch. He leaned in closer, the scent of the rain and the docks clinging to his tactical gear. "I'm not a lawyer, Julian, and this isn't a courtroom." He nodded toward the massive projection screens that usually displayed Vane's charitable milestones. Suddenly, the screens flickered to life, but it wasn't the Harmony Foundation's glossy promotional videos. It was the dead man's switch Elias had spent 48 hours cracking, the encrypted ledger of every child sold, every bribe paid, and every politician bought. On the high-definition displays, Vane's own face appeared in grainy hidden camera footage from his private office, discussing inventory and shipping costs with a chilling corporate detachment. The ballroom erupted into a different kind of chaos. The wealthy friends Vane had cultivated scrambled away from him as if he were radioactive, their own names appearing in the scrolling data of the ledger. Vane turned to the crowd, his hands out in a desperate plea. "It's a fabrication, a deepfake." "It's your own heartbeat, Julian, and I've just sent the decryption key to every news outlet and federal agency in the country. You wanted to be a man of the people. Now the people know exactly who you are." As the distant sound of sirens finally began to wail in the valley below, Roman grabbed Vane by the collar. He didn't strike him. He didn't reach for the handgun holstered at his hip. Instead, he dragged the billionaire through the service entrance and out to the cold, driving rain of the estate's back alley. There, the street justice was waiting. It wasn't the police. It was a silent line of dock workers, fathers from the Rainier Valley, and the older brothers of children who had never come home. They stood in the shadows of the pines, their faces etched with a grim, righteous fury. Roman shoved Vane toward them. The billionaire stumbled into the mud, his bespoke suit ruined, looking up at the wall of men who had no price. "I can give you money," Vane shrieked. "Anything you want." Roman stepped back into the doorway, his silhouette a jagged shadow against the ballroom lights. He looked at the men, then at Vane. "I didn't bring you here to kill you, Julian," Roman said, his eyes cold as the Pacific. "I brought you here to be judged by the people you thought were too small to matter." Roman turned away as the circle closed in. He didn't look back when the screaming started. He had spent a lifetime being a monster to survive the dark, but as he walked away, he realized that for the first time, he was walking toward the light. 1 year later, the rain still fell over Seattle, but it no longer felt like a shroud. From the top floor of his obsidian tower, Roman Caldwell watched the city lights flicker through the mist. He was still the man who moved the gears of the underworld. He was still the Iron Kingpin whose name carried the weight of a death sentence for those who broke the code. But the empire he ruled had fundamentally shifted its axis. The cold, sterile atmosphere of his office had been breached. Beside the single black ledger and the fountain pen, there was now a framed drawing. It was a simple sketch done in vibrant yellow and blue crayon, depicting a large man holding a small hand. It was the only splash of color in the room, and to Roman, it was more valuable than any shipment that had ever crossed the docks. His daily briefings had changed too. He still managed the logistics of the city, but now a significant portion of his resources were diverted towards the Sarah Initiative, a network of safe houses and private investigators dedicated to finding the children the system continued to fail. He had found that power was far more intoxicating when used as a shield rather than a hammer.
He was still a monster to the predators of the world, but to the forgotten, he had become a silent, vengeful guardian. A soft knock at the door broke his concentration. He didn't reach for the holster beneath his desk. Instead, his stern features softened in a way that would have terrified his enemies. Violet walked in, her dark hair long and braided, wearing a new yellow dress that was clean and bright. She wasn't the trembling ghost from the gala anymore. She carried a backpack and a sense of belonging that filled the cavernous room. "Are you done with the boring papers, Roman?" Violet asked, her voice steady and full of life. Roman stood, his Nordic runes on his hands catching the light as he closed his ledger. "I'm done," he replied, his voice a low, warm rumble. As they walked together toward the elevator, Marco and the other guards snapped to attention, their eyes reflecting a new sense of purpose. They weren't just protecting a king, they were protecting a home. Roman looked down at the girl who had once pointed a finger at a monster, and in doing so had saved the soul of a man who thought he was beyond redemption. He had spent 30 years living in the cold silence of his own making, believing that sentiment was a liability. But as he felt Violet's small hand slip into his, the monster of Seattle did something he hadn't done since he was 12 years old, standing in a rain-bruised valley. He smiled. The Iron Kingpin was still the boss of the streets, but he was no longer a prisoner of the dark. He had finally found home.